USCIS will always deny your naturalization application and will probably also issue a notice to appear for you to show up in immigration court and defend yourself from removal. Permanent residents and even some US citizens are understandably scared right now about what the Trump administration is doing to immigrants. And it's all understandable. But I also think a lot of the fear is disproportionate to what's actually happening to the majority of people who are going through these processes with USCIS. And something specifically that I want to discuss is whether you should be afraid of submitting an application to naturalize, because I've spoken to multiple people who have applications for naturalization pending who consulted with me because they wanted me to withdraw their applications because they don't want to show up to the interview, end up getting detained. They would rather be permanent residents. And frankly, I had to talk them all off a cliff because they all had pretty strong naturalization applications. And even if they were going to get denied, at least in these specific cases, it's fact specific, so this doesn't apply to everyone. In these cases, like one of them had a real chance of getting denied. But even if it got denied, that was going to be the end of it. USCIS was not going to issue a notice to appear. The person wasn't going to end up losing their permanent residence. They might just be found to not have the good character that's required right now for naturalization, which would mean that they would need to reapply in the future once they can demonstrate 5 years of good character. I would like to give you an example of somebody I recently spoke to who has a strong application for naturalization but who was scared. And my hope is that this video will help at least one other person take the jump to naturalize. Because if you're eligible for naturalization and you want to naturalize, the time to do it is now. Don't wait, because the Trump administration is making the process harder. They're in the process of adding requirements. They're about to make the citizenship test harder. They're about to find more ways to find that you don't have good character when you're applying for naturalization. So if you're considering applying or you want to apply, I would either do it now or wait until the president changes and the immigration policies change, because it's probably only going to get harder over the next few years until the government changes. One group of people who should apply now if they want to naturalize is people who were charged with crimes a long time ago and whose crimes were dismissed. So there was no final conviction, or they were charged with a crime and it was reduced to something really low level, like disorderly conduct or like a violation level trespass or something like that. If that happened outside of the last 5 years, there's a really good chance that that's not going to be used against you when you apply for naturalization. And even if it somehow is used against you, like for example, you have a pattern of doing stuff like that, and the most recent instance of it was within the last 5 years, USCIS might determine that you don't currently possess 5 years of good character since you had that bad character event in the last 5 years. But that would be the end of it. You would just get a denial decision and you would have the opportunity to reapply once enough time has passed, 5 years, from that bad character event. In the last few weeks, I've had several clients who have a colorful history of criminal arrests, but most of these arrests happened like 10 plus years ago, who recently naturalized. So just having a criminal history will not by itself make you ineligible for naturalization. However, if you have any arrest, even one from 40 years ago, what you need to do is contact the clerk's office of the criminal court where that arrest or conviction or criminal matter took place and ask them for a certificate of disposition for each arrest. This is a bit annoying to do, but oftentimes you can achieve it by just making a phone call and mailing them like a check for $5 or $10. And then a few days later, you'll receive the physical certificate of disposition in the mail with like the court seal. Some states call it something different, but if you call the court clerk and you say, I want a certificate of disposition, and they say, we don't know what that is, you say, I want a piece of paper that says what the final outcome was for this charge or arrest, and it needs to have the stamp or seal of a court. Every courthouse in the United States has some version of that. And that's what you're gonna need when it's time to submit your naturalization application. And that's actually what I'm gonna need to be able to consult with you about what consequences might flow from submitting this application. I need to see what your final convictions were for before I can legally advise you on whether or not it's a good idea to apply for naturalization. Because some convictions will result in you actually getting deported when you apply for naturalization. The best example of this is something referred to as an aggravated felony. If your crime is classified as an aggravated felony under immigration law, which has nothing to do with whether or not it's a misdemeanor or felony under state law, by the way, then USCIS will always deny your naturalization application and will probably also issue a notice to appear for you to show up in immigration court and defend yourself from removal. And by the way, if you have an aggravated felony, you are subject to mandatory detention. So showing up to your naturalization interview could be the last time you're free in the United States, at least until a judge makes a final decision on your removal case while you are detained the entire time. You can still win your case and get released, but the chances of that are pretty low. There are a couple things that I generally screen people for when I'm determining whether we should apply for naturalization. Criminal history is like the main thing. If you don't have any major convictions, they're all really low level, like disorderly conduct, or they happened a long time ago. What I'd like to see is your convictions were dismissed or reduced substantially and more than 5 years ago from when the consequences was served. So for example, let's say you got a DUI in New York and you got this DUI 10 years ago. That's actually not a felony, that's a misdemeanor. There's no immigration consequences that directly flow from a simple DUI in New York if you are a permanent resident and there were no aggravating factors, at least as of today in August 2025. So you would not be deportable, you would not be inadmissible, but that's a major bad character event. So if you got a DUI and then let's say you got 1 year of probation and your probation ended, in 2017. I would calculate 5 years from when your probation ended. And in 2022, once 5 years are over, I would submit your application for naturalization because more than 5 years have passed since the consequence of that bad character event, and we can clearly show 5 years of good character to be eligible for naturalization. But I would also screen you for some other stuff. How many times have you been married? If the answer is divorced or anything other than I've been married 0 or 1 time and I'm currently living with that person and everything's fine. If you've been divorced before, I would check to see, do you have any outstanding alimony, outstanding child support? If you have other children from a marriage or extramarital, it doesn't matter. The government wants to see that you're supporting them if they aren't living with you, unless they're not your biological children. In that case, absent a court order, you would not be required to show that you're taking care of those kids. If they're like your stepkids, this doesn't really apply to you. I would also ask you some other questions, like did you ever falsely claim to be a US citizen? Do you owe any overdue taxes? Do you have any military service? And if so, there might be some follow-up questions depending on what country you served in. If you're from certain countries like China, I might ask you questions about ties to communism. A lot of people who went to college in China joined their college's local communist party as just a way to excel academically. It's highly encouraged, and I would ask you questions about that participation. These questions are more likely to come up when it's time for permanent residence, but it's also worth visiting them when it's time for naturalization because these are questions that are on the actual application. So if I go through everything and I determine, this has a strong chance of success, I would probably recommend applying for naturalization. And I will say that most of the people who are terrified about continuing with the naturalization process, whom I've met with, actually have really strong applications. And my general recommendation to them is you shouldn't withdraw this. Or if they haven't filed it yet, I would say you should file this as soon as possible before policies change that might change whether or not you're eligible. Now, this is not legal advice. I'm not saying that even though you think your naturalization application is weak, you should apply anyway. What I'm saying is you should talk to a lawyer before you actually decide what the risks for you are. Because most of the people whom I've spoken to have strong applications, even though they thought that they didn't. So if you're not sure and you want to talk to a lawyer, you could always speak directly with me. My information for scheduling a consultation, the direct booking link, is in the video description below. I would love to speak to you about your case. If you have any arrests in your history, get as much info before the consultation. Ideally, get copies of the certificates of disposition and upload them to your case portal before the consultation starts, or email them to my office. My staff will forward it to me so it's available for the consultation, and we'll go through everything from start to finish to see what your chances of success are. And if you don't have a super high chance of success or any chance of not succeeding, what are the worst case scenarios? Will it just get denied? Can you apply again? Or is there a chance you could actually be placed in removal proceedings? I would be happy to go through all this with you guys during a consultation if you are interested. If you're new to my channel and you just want to learn what's happening on the ground in immigration world under Trump's policies directly from the perspective of an immigration lawyer, or you're trying to do some applications by yourself and you just want to stay up to date on how to avoid major pitfalls, be sure to subscribe to my channel. I put out several videos each week trying to educate the immigrant community on applying for immigration benefits, and I'll see you guys next time for another video.